Thank you, Lakisha. It's great, actually, that this will be, the next session will be on the future, about the future. It is a continuation of what we just heard about post-pandemic experience. And the future of GCP inspection, that's titled for our session. And we'll discuss about the experience and lesson learned during the COVID pandemic, and also focusing on different kind of tools, the agency in particular from FDA perspective, as well as from MHRA, that had been used during the pandemic, and also to discuss the pro and con of different kind of alternative data verification, whether remote regulatory assessment or remote inspection that as a regulatory agency call. I mean, the names, we call it remote regulatory assessment. For example, our European colleagues tend to call it remote inspection. We have 3 speakers. 2 of them are in person here, and one is going to use alternative technology, and the presentation will be through video. And the first speaker will be Jen Seller, who is a branch chief from the Office of Scientific Investigation at the FDA, and joined by Lieutenant Jennifer Adams, who is the Director for Foreign Cadre from Office of Regulatory Affairs within the FDA, and Rachel Mates from MHRA UK will be presenting her section through the video. And without further ado, I'm going to invite my colleague, Jen Sellers, to come to the podium and start her presentation. Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Jennifer, as well as Rachel.
Thank you, Casa. Good morning. Happy Valentine's Day. All right. I am going to spend 15 minutes to tell you about RRA, Remote Regulatory Assessment, from marketing application review point of view. Okay, so bear with me. 15 minutes. First, I'm going to share our experience of RRA during the pandemic. Then the lessons we learned from the marketing application review perspective, and then future use of RRAs. So before we get to the topic of RRA, I would like to tell you a little bit what we do. So we, Office of Scientific Investigations, the center of Cedar Center, we conduct compliance review for marketing applications, new drug applications, NDAs, BLA, biologic license applications. We cover GCP, routine GCP, not for cause. Our branch cover routine GCP inspections of clinical investigator, sponsor, and the CIOs. So these inspections for phase 1 bioequivalence studies are covered by different office, OSIS. We'll hear from them tomorrow. So now you know our purview. So let's take a look at the review process. So in this process, we collaborate with multiple stakeholders: MHRA, Health Canada, EMA, PMDA. We also collaborate with our own FDA coworkers. All right, here's the review division. We collaborate with them. And then ORA, Office of Regulatory Affairs. So you have heard from Foreign Cadre Director Barbara, Rick, and Jenna, our wonderful Jenna is here. So we collaborate with them. And when the review division receives NDAs, BLAs, and when GCP inspections are warranted, we collaborate with them and we make decisions which clinical investigators we wanted to inspect. We also decide whether we wanted to inspect a sponsor or CIOs. And once we make that decision, we generate inspection assignment memo, give very specific instructions about how the inspections will be conducted. And then ORA received inspection assignment memo conduct inspections, and then send us back the inspection report. So we review all the inspection reports for the particular application, and we make CIS, Clinical Inspection Summary, and we make recommendations about data integrity and the study conduct adequacy. And we send the CIS to the review division, and then review division make regulatory decisions based on the reviews from all disciplines. All right, pandemic. Just like Jason just mentioned about the pandemic, it was only 4 years ago when hundreds, thousands of patients died from COVID in a day. So the pandemic has impacted almost every aspect of our life and work. GCP inspection was no exception. So how did we assess the impact of pandemic on GCP inspections? Again, we are talking about our purview, the inspections for routine PDUFA user fee applications. So we looked at total number of inspections in the fiscal year 15 to 21. So as you can see, in 2020, the total number of inspections dropped. And then 21 bounced back a little bit. So probably due to factors such as the availability of COVID vaccine. And then we also look into 5 year, the total number of inspections in the 5 years prior to the pandemic, and calculate the average, which was 418. So compared to the average, FY20 decreased 23%, and FY21, 6%. So FDA, like the other agencies around the world, responded to the pandemic quickly, adapted to the public health crisis, and used alternative tools to assess GCP compliance. So one of the tools we used was RRA. So I have a question for you. What is RRA? So is RRA a inspection? If you say yes, raise your hand. So if you say no, raise your hand. Thank you. Most said no. So the terminology of RRA has evolved. FDA issued first draft guidance in 2021, and then updated in 2022. And then most recently, last month, 2024, issued another draft guidance. So according to the most recent guidance, RRA is remote examination of FDA-regulated establishment and or its records to evaluate compliance with applicable FDA requirements. So the establishments here, I'm talking about, it's clinical investigator, sponsor investigator, sponsor and CIOs. Most of you got it. So to FDA, RRA is not inspection. So as you can see, we have Venn diagram here. So the peach color represents inspection, turquoise, RRA. The overlap area represents the similarities and the other areas, differences. Okay, so let's take a look at the inspection first. So FDA to FDA inspections is FDA officials physically enter the physical address of establishment, display the credentials like Rick mentioned, I'm here, I'm FDA, I'm here for inspection, and then present 482, that's the notice of inspection. And then when there are objectionable observations, FDA will issue 483. On the other hand, RRA is remote, and for GCP purpose, RRA is voluntary, which means when FDA requests RRA, the establishment can decline the request. However, if FDA determines GCP assessment is necessary, and if you decline the RRA, FDA may decide to have inspection. And then you don't get to opt out for inspection. All right, since RRA is not inspection, so there's no credentials, no 482s. However, if there are objectionable observations, those observations findings will not be documented in 483, but will be documented in writing. It's just not in 483 form. So let's take a look at the commonalities, the similarities between the inspection and the RRA. So both can have meetings either in person or virtual, both can verify data, both can assess compliance, and observations can be documented in writing, and FDA can take regulatory actions based on the observations. Doesn't matter, it's inspection or RRA. Now, let's take a look at the RRAs that we have reviewed during the pandemic for FY20 and 21. So there were a total of 72 RRAs conducted. So FY20, we had 39 RRAs. The top two therapeutic area that these RRAs supported for approval, the first one is oncology. The second one is antiviral. Mostly it's anti-COVID drugs. In FY21, we had 33 RRAs. Again, oncology was the first top therapeutic area that these RRAs supported. The second one is rare diseases. Let's take a look at the RRAs categories by application, submission, and whether it was designated as a mission critical. So as you can see, almost 70% of our RRAs supported NDA, about 30% supported BLA, and then almost 80% of RRAs supported original submissions, and then 20% for supplements. And then almost 60% of our RRAs supported mission-critical applications. And these are the RRAs categories by establishment type and the locations of establishment. As you can see, 80% RRAs were for clinical investigators and 20% for sponsor CIOs. And then about 80% of our RRAs were for establishment outside the US. Lessons learned. This is what we learned from our perspective. RRAs were useful in the assessment of data reliability, subject safety, and clinical trial conduct. RRAs supported FDA's mission and informed regulatory decisions. So let's think about the benefits of RRA. So RRA is a valuable tool to verify data submitted. It allows FDA to assess GCP and regulatory compliance remotely to support regulatory decisions. It expands the breadth of FDA's GCP oversight. It has potential to save time and money. So you may ask, for the future use of RRA, when may FDA request an RRA? The answer is whenever. Whenever FDA determines RRA is useful, it's it's useful to help to assess the GCP compliance of establishments to support regulatory decisions, or when there are travel restrictions and then we cannot do inspections. Take-home message. RRA is a valuable tool for regulatory agencies to assess GCP compliance. All right. First, I'd like to thank our director, Dr. Ayalu, for the help with the slides, and then our site team for the work on the paper we published, and then our staff, GCPAB, for review of RRA memo, and our wonderful ORA colleagues for conducting RRAs. I have references here. The first one is the draft guidance published in January 2024. The second one is the paper we published. This concludes my presentation. Now I will turn over to Jenna, our ORA. She'll talk about her perspective of RRA. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sellers, for that great perspective on RRAs and marketing authorization approval. So my name is Jennifer Adams, and I work for and represent here the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations within the Office of Regulatory Affairs. I'll be beginning this discussion today discussing the evolution of the remote regulatory assessment through time. I'll be talking about RRAs in the transition to post-COVID and in our steady state. And then we'll close discussing RRAs looking towards the future. Now, I'll be the first to note that there is a bit of a disconnect between the session title, The Future of GCP Inspections, and the topics here. And implied in that disconnect is really the balance that we as an agency are trying to strike in terms of how we are going to incorporate this new tool of RRA into our regulatory toolbox. Now, new tools are good, and the pandemic has given us this amazing tool, RRAs. They served us well during the pandemic when we were unable to travel to so many destinations throughout the world, domestic and international. And they supported marketing review for our center colleagues in that time. You'll pick up on the fact that this is an evolving conversation, and the answer of where RRAs fits in depends a lot on who you ask and what they're trying to assess. There is a hope that RRAs can be a quicker, easier, cheaper equivalent to an inspection, but you'll see later on in my slides that that is just not always the case for GCP RRAs. Now, here as a representative for Office of Bioresearch Monitoring, we conduct the majority of GCP operations that this agency does. We did a little over 1,100 last year, including a quarter of which were in a foreign environment. There are other representatives of our agency that are here, for example, the Office of Study Integrity and Surveillance, who also conduct inspections and RRAs, for example, for bioanalytical, and you'll be hearing more about their perspectives and their use of this tool tomorrow. But the focus of this presentation really is on the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring and our experiences with GCP-focused RRAs. So for the next two slides, I've split the evolution of RRAs between foreign and domestic because the way these operations work are a little different in these two different scenarios. The first thing you'll notice is that RRAs existed prior to the pandemic. So we didn't call them RRAs at the time, but we did have tools for instances where we were unable to travel to conduct on-site inspections or unable to access records in the location where they were generated. We asked sponsors or clinical sites to conduct certified copies, make certified copies of records and ship them to a US location, usually a sponsor or a US agent for our review. You can tell that these were relatively rare in the pre-pandemic world, less than 5 per calendar year leading up to the pandemic. These pre-RRAs did involve interviews, although oftentimes those interviews were mediated through a CRO or sponsor representative. And the records request, importantly, was not iterative. So we asked for copies of certified records and we got what we got. There was no re-request for clarifying documentation, with one important difference between RRAs in the pre-pandemic versus RRAs today. Now, during the pandemic, as I mentioned, these really were our only way to assess study data and human subject protection and support application review. We began the pandemic with no SOPs. We had very limited access to and experience with the tools that we needed to conduct remote regulatory assessments. For example, teleconferencing, all of these tools we know now. And we had very limited understanding of what was required to move forward with RRAs, especially in the foreign arena. We ended up working with clinical investigator sites to obtain approval from their institutions and their data privacy officers. We encouraged them to reach out to their institutional ethics committees to ensure that the appropriate approvals were needed. And in some cases, sites, especially in the foreign arena, had to actually go out and reconsent subjects so their data could be electronically shared with FDA for our remote review. With the understanding during the pandemic, as my colleague Richard Burning mentioned, that we recognized these were not anyone's top priority during the pandemic. We had an ongoing infection, outbreaks occurred, mandatory closures, people had their own personal scenarios, clinical investigators were trying to treat patients still, and we had so many RRAs that were either declined due to, for example, data privacy issues, or canceled even at the last minute due to personal circumstances that precluded the conduct. Nonetheless, we were able to accomplish just shy of 35 RRAs. And if you're doing the math in your head and comparing to Dr. Seller's presentation, these RRAs actually include all RRAs that OBIMO conducted for all of the centers. So this would include centers and as well as OSIS outside of the office OSI. Over time, across the pandemic, we really evolved and developed this tool. We developed our SOPs. We gained much greater familiarity with the tools that we all know associated with remote work. And we gained a much greater understanding of how to conduct these RRAs, what the limitations are for human subject records review through painstaking experience. And we learned what types of inspection assignments were more suitable for this format than others. Now, on the domestic side, as I mentioned before, some differences. There was no real need for an RRA prior to the pandemic. We have investigators that are located all over the United States, and so access to facilities is not really an issue that we have there. But during the pandemic, we conducted just shy of 20 domestic RRAs each year, 2020 to 2021. You see the number drop in 2022 and then rise again in 2023. This is largely related to an institutional review board, RRA pilot, that I'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a few slides. Now, in September 2020, the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations conducted an analysis. We wanted to look at applications for which at least one remote regulatory assessment and one on-site inspection were completed in support of the same application. We were looking for apples to apples comparison with two primary factors for consideration. The first being resource burn and the second being coverage. We ended up with 15 applications representing 33 on-site inspections and 25 RRAs. And I should note here that the majority of the on-site inspections were domestic, as you might imagine. The majority of the RRAs were foreign. So our first question, resource burn. How much time do these take? And this matters for you, the regulated industry, as well. The numbers presented on this slide is the number of hours that it takes an investigator to complete a given operation divided by the total number of operational hours for an investigator for a year. So this is the proportion of an investigator's year dedicated to a single operation, on average presented for RRAs and inspections. And what you're probably seeing is that the RRAs do take longer. In fact, in this analysis, 73% more time. Now, there is a caveat that has been raised on a couple of occasions that what if we were to incorporate travel into this analysis rather than just operational time, especially given that most of these RRAs are done in a foreign environment? It's a salient point. I think it's difficult for me to imagine how you would incorporate a counterfactual scenario into the analysis. You know, an investigator traveling from Savannah, Georgia to Frankfurt, how long their flight time would be. But it's a salient point that I think it would improve this comparison regarding resource burn. Not sure by how much, but it might improve that. Now let's look at our next main factor, coverage. You can tell on the left, RRA coverage, 95% of these were limited in one aspect. While for inspections of, again, apples to apples, same application, 97% were comprehensive. Now there's a number of reasons why RRAs may have been limited in this manner. The first and biggest one is that largely the records that we're receiving for RRAs are redacted of personal identifiers. This means names, dates of birth, signatures, identifying information has been removed from the records that we're reviewing, whereas on-site we would have access to those identified records. This can present a big challenge, and in particular looking at, for example, informed consent documentation, the linchpin of human subjects protection. We're unable to really assess meaningful informed consent documentation without any of the identifying information present. Second, it's difficult to assess internal consistency within records. So is this medical history that was uploaded for subject 12 really the same individual that was dosed at visit 3? Again, without identifiers, there's no way to link those two together, and we end up in a position where we just have to trust that the site has uploaded in good faith. And for this reason, these RRAs are not an ideal, they're a particularly poor solution for assignments where there's data integrity concerns, as you all might imagine. In addition, there were some instances, as Richard Burning mentioned, where due to resource limitations, our clinical investigator sites in particular were unable to share with us the full scope of records that we would have access to physically in an on-site inspection. You know, they just don't have the time and resources, especially during the pandemic, for us to expect them to scan every scrap of paper associated with voluminous trial records. In addition, some of these sites, as I mentioned before, had to have subjects come and reconsent to participate, have their records included in the remote regulatory assessment. In instances where subjects were not able to return to the sites to reconsent, or where they did not consent to having their records shared electronically, we were absent those records for our remote reviews. And then lastly, there were some instances where sites told us due to their data privacy regulations, they were unable to share certain records with us wholesale. And so in those instances, we had to come and review what records they were allowed to share with us as best we could. Now, this is one of the biggest concerns about RRAs, really, and specifically GCP RRAs, that's inherent to the types of records that we're reviewing. These are not batch records. They're not manufacturing records. They're not analysis records. They're not records about process. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these are records about human subjects. And this is why conceptually RRAs seem very straightforward, but in practice can be very challenging. So now we turn to the steady state, 2023. The first thing that you notice is the numbers have decreased since the pandemic. When and where we've been able to travel, we do to conduct on-site inspections with the understanding that they are our gold standard that we can offer and we owe to our center counterparts in the review of applications and ultimately to the American consumer to ensure the products that they're accessing are safe and effective. The second thing you'll notice is there's this bolus of IRB RRAs, Institutional Review Board RRAs. This is related to a pilot project that OBIMO has been conducting with the Center for Drug Evaluation, Center for Biologics, and Center for Device and Radiological Health, where we're looking at a voluntary option of IRBs participating in RRAs. Now, there's a number of factors that are considered when determining which types of assignments are best suited for this pilot project, including inspection history, study types that are under review at a particular IRB, and various other logistical factors. Now, this team is still finalizing their analysis, but 2 points that I'll highlight preliminarily is that these IRBs, RRAs, did actually take more time than their on-site inspection counterparts, something that we know and recognize from our prior analysis, but that there was a certain amount of additional scheduling flexibility due to the lack of travel. Now, it's notable that there are no CI or sponsor or CRO RRAs in 2023. This is really the bread and butter of our program, our GCP program in OBIMO. This is due to the resource and coverage concerns that I expressed in earlier slides, but also an increasing concern about the legality of electronic transfer of clinical records globally. I mentioned before, there are reconsent issues at stake, there's an extensive redaction process, and we're often going about these feasibility negotiations via an interpreter in a different language over Zoom. It's just very challenging. So when we can travel to conduct on-site inspections, we are, with the understanding that, as Dr. Sellers mentioned, RRAs are not inspections, they're not equivalent. Now, other programs like food and drug manufacturing programs have been folding RRAs into their work plan. But there is something about, especially international, transfer of sensitive private information regarding the health of human subjects via an electronic portal that makes GCP RRAs really unique. So let's look towards the future. FDA issued a guidance document in 2022 that was recently updated, and there's actually another additional guidance document that's specific to BIMO. Both of these documents are out at the SBIA booth, so if you have a chance, go stop by and read a copy. But this guidance document indicates, as Dr. Sellers mentioned, that FDA can initiate or request an RRA whenever deemed appropriate, using a risk-based approach that includes the location of a firm, their inspection history, the complexity of the assignment, and any travel restrictions. So to summarize, RRAs are still very much a valuable tool in our toolbox. No one knows when the next potential global pandemic could hit. In addition, there are unique circumstances, even in a post-COVID world, where RRAs are going to be appropriate. The thing is, we have to come into these decisions with the understanding of the limitations of this tool and ensure that we're incorporating that understanding into our risk-based decision. So with that, I will turn this over to my MHRA colleague, Rachel Mead, for her recorded presentation.
Hello everyone, I am Rachel Mead, a Senior GCP Inspector at the MHRA. I'll be presenting about GCP inspections that we conduct, as well as the future of those. So when conducting a GCP inspection, MHRA inspectors are examining compliance of an organisation's clinical trial research procedures and systems in accordance with the UK Statutory Instrument 2004-1031. That's the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trials Regulations and its subsequent amendments, including 2006-1928. This gives inspectors the right to inspect any site involved in UK clinical trial activities and also describes the fees that are to be charged. The Human Medicines Regulations also give rights of access, powers of inspection, sampling and seizure, as well as describing the findings and reporting of inspections. These regulations also make it a criminal offence to obstruct an inspector during the conduct of an inspection. In terms of the types of GCP inspections performed, we have a national risk-based programme. So these inspections are generally systems-based, meaning that inspectors examine the systems and procedures used to conduct clinical research in the UK by both commercial and non-commercial organisations to comply with existing national GCP regulations. But GCP risk scheduling is challenging, as the GCP ecosystem is a constantly changing environment. So there's no requirement to be registered or licensed to conduct clinical trials, and organisations are often closing, merging, emerging all the time. And that makes the GCP inspection universe very difficult to know and manage. We perform triggered inspections, usually as a result of information received by the MHRA about suspected violations of legislation relating to the conduct of clinical trials. We also accredit organisations conducting phase 1 trials, in particular those conducting first-in-human trials. And that scheme aims to make sure trials are as safe as possible and to create public confidence in the regulation of phase 1 trials. We also conduct marketing authorization application inspections, as well as joint inspections with other agencies. As mentioned, inspectors have the right to inspect any site involved in clinical trial activities in the UK. So the types of organisations inspected is many and very varied. So this can range from small GP surgeries, who are maybe an investigator site on one trial, up to large global commercial sponsors, and really everything in between. So typically an MHRA GCP inspection will consist of 3 main parts. First of those is planning. So you'll receive a notification from the head of GCP with a request for information about your organisation. We call this a dossier, and also information about the trials that you conduct. Once received, that's reviewed by your allocated lead inspector, and they'll be in touch to arrange the inspection and provide a plan for its conduct. The second part then is the inspection itself. So that will start with an opening meeting to provide details of the scope of the inspection. During the inspection, there'll be document and data review, a review of systems, interview sessions with relevant personnel involved in the trials selected, and really that's the personnel doing the tasks, not the management, and maybe a facility tour. Lastly, there'll be a closing meeting where provisional feedback on inspection findings will be presented, as well as an outline of the next steps. So if there's any critical findings that are identified during your inspection, they'll be referred to the Inspection Action Group, who are a non-statutory multidisciplinary group which advise on recommendations for regulatory action. And then the third and final part, after the inspection, you'll receive a report of the findings and you'll provide a CAPA in response. And once that's accepted, a GCP inspection statement will be provided to close the inspection. But prior to this pandemic, GCP inspectors were already making use of remote inspections. So whether that was prior to the on-site inspection, as we've described, with a day 1 evaluation, or instead of an on-site inspection. So for example, for GCP, this has included a review of specific systems. So for example, the remote review of pharmacovigilance for clinical trials with a focus on the reference safety information. But we've also used remote inspections for taking place after an on-site inspection where there were significant issues to follow up. However, the shift during the pandemic was to complete only essential on-site inspections. So this included some triggered inspections plus those to support COVID-19. Therefore, we had to shift to mostly remote inspections. So for GCP, we prioritise systems that lend themselves to remote review. So many organisations have an ETMF, which we could easily review remotely. And with the increasing use of technology, there's a focus on how data integrity is maintained and how this is controlled, including who controls the data and is able to change it. But we try to be pragmatic, reducing burden wherever possible, particularly for those organisations on the front line. We did this as a risk-based approach, so NHS sites were not inspected unless critical to enable essential COVID-19 work to continue. Trials are evolving and becoming more complex and adaptive in design, with multiple arms, many e-systems, lots of different vendors. So naturally, with such trials, there is a focus on the sponsor oversight and how they keep track of all those changes and ensuring there are effective change control measures in place. So, for example, if an amendment requires updates to multiple documents, plans, e-systems, and so on. In order to facilitate remote inspections, we've used document exchange platforms to upload our written requests, as well as receive documents, and have found some platforms to be much more user-friendly than others. And you'll also hear more about remote and hybrid BE, so bioequivalence inspections, tomorrow from my colleague, Michael McGuinness. So what are the expectations regarding research conducted during the pandemic? So we know that due to the pressures on frontline staff and resources, prioritisation of trials had to take place at sites, with decisions on pausing recruitment and halting some trials in their entirety. We saw this right across trials from phase 1, first in human, but right through to phase 4 trials. The MHRA issued guidance on managing these trials in a huge cross-agency effort, as well as we all had to come together really to understand how to navigate this unprecedented situation. As the pandemic unfolded, it became apparent that there'd be a significant effect on the data that could be collected from ongoing trials. So with patient visits limited, the data collected would be less, and depending on the criticality of that data, this could mean that the trial objectives may not be met. So in this case, we'd advise that sponsors come and speak to the regulator about this. We also expect to see an increase in the number of protocol deviations. It is expected that a risk-based approach is taken to the documentation of those protocol deviations. So deviations that impact on participant safety and the reliability of results should be identified, documented, and then taken into account when that data is analysed. Minor protocol deviations should also be identified, and these can be documented at a trial level, so rather than at an individual level. So, for example, documenting that participant visits that were performed remotely, or perhaps that IMP was delivered directly to participants at home where this was not originally intended. Questions have also arisen in relation to the quality of the data, so where on-site monitoring has not been able to be carried out, and remote monitoring has occurred in its place. Some sponsors have felt that once it's safe to be back on site, that remonitoring would need to take place. So we'd advise that this is done on a risk-based approach. Therefore, if there are concerns about data quality or there's data that's critical to the reliability of the results of the trial, such that you'd only have confidence in that data if monitoring took place. But we certainly wouldn't see the need for remonitoring in all cases. And also trial teams had to navigate participants receiving their COVID-19 vaccines during trials and then the unblinding of treatment in those vaccine trials without compromising the trial data. So what did these remote inspections highlight? We continued our routine national risk-based inspection programme, as well as inspections of sponsors, CROs, labs and investigator sites, both for vaccines and antiviral medications. Sponsors and CROs had to set up and conduct clinical trials in a really short space of time and had to implement many new processes. So whilst it's essential to ensure processes are defined to assure the quality of the trial and these should be followed, it was not unexpected that there were some issues due to the pressure people were under. However, it is important to identify the findings for those to be considered by inspectees in relation to the conduct of these and other trials. So I just wanted to highlight a few areas of non-compliance which really were quite specific to these trials and the times that we were in. We saw an increased use of consent by professionals, so as opposed to personal legal representatives from the investigator site for consenting of adults lacking capacity. This was because personal legal representatives were not being allowed into hospitals. We also had findings identified as legal representatives were not always independent of the trial, so sometimes they were the PI or a sub-investigator. And there was also use of verbal consent only due to the strict infection control measures in place and the use of paper in hospitals. But that's not in compliance with UK law, the trial's ethical approval, or indeed the protocol. We also saw the use of deferred consent, where a sponsor had informed investigator sites that consent was not required prior to randomisation. And there were also findings because participants were not consented once they'd regained capacity. We saw the use of data from registries, For example, the date of hospital discharge, or ethnicity data, or date of death, and it was given preference over the data entered into the ECRF and authorised by a PI. There was lack of data integrity controls of laboratory data, including data being generated in a modifiable format and saved to an unsecure location, and also insufficient audit trails. We also identified that there was no evidence of samples for the primary endpoint being processed or frozen as per protocol requirements. The fast setup of ECRFs meant delays in applying edit checks, leading to non-compliance not being detected and preventative actions not being implemented in a timely manner. We also saw that non-commercial sponsor teams had edit access to the ECRF, but those changes then didn't subsequently require PI approval. We also saw that monitoring was not implemented until really quite high numbers of participants had been recruited, or a failure to identify non-compliances which could impact on the safety of participants or data integrity, and also a lack of monitoring at local labs which were responsible for management of the samples for a primary endpoint. So we really did learn a lot during the pandemic, and researchers, regulators, and those that generously participated in trials had achieved a lot really in a short space of time. And this is built on key areas such as early engagement for development of medicines, working across networks not only to deliver trials but to deliver efficacious products into the market when safe to do so, with the end goal of getting new and innovative products to patients much sooner. So where does this take us? Remote inspections have been a success. We know we were able to maintain oversight, ensuring patient safety and public health, as well as identifying critical issues, and they will continue to be used in the future. There have been process improvements too, so that's particularly around document sharing and the use of MS Teams for that, as well as using it for video calls and the large numbers of staff joining interviews. This is also a modernisation of inspections. Inspectors really are working in the same way as those being inspected, and that is remotely. Many trials are globally run with teams spread far and wide, with very little paper used. There's less of a need to be sat in a conference room at the company headquarters to look at a laptop when companies are now paper light. It also reduces the carbon footprint of our agency. We can access a number of systems remotely too, so the ECRF, the ETMF, but ePro and health records too. That being said, it isn't possible to do everything remotely. Can you tour a facility efficiently without a camera crew and a host? You know, we have done this, but it is hard work. Can we look at individual computers or equipment? So look at system settings, network connections, serial numbers, or even physical verification of IMP supplies. It's also not easy. We've had to adapt our skills as inspectors, including managing effective interviews online and often with many more people, as it's obviously easier to dial into a call than to fly halfway across the world for an on-site inspection. And also manage access to lots of e-systems and the associated training that comes with them. But we have received a positive response from industry. We know it supports the health and safety of the company staff too. It allows for greater flexibility with work schedule of inspectees and is a motivation to continue standards of compliance, even in times of extreme change. It's also fair to say that our profile has been raised during the last few years, so it's especially important to make sure we continue to increase the trust and confidence of the public in the regulators, but also it facilitates maintenance of the pharmaceutical supply chain, it enables oversight of clinical trial activities, and continues to promote access to promising innovative therapy. So what's ahead for us? Well, the Medicines and Medical Devices Act of 2021 provides us the power to update the legislation for clinical trials. So this brings the opportunity, with us having now left the European Union, to design a world-class sovereign regulatory environment for clinical trials that will support the development of innovative medicines and legislation that reflects innovative trial design and delivery. The new International Recognition Procedure, so IRP, went live on January the 1st in order to speed up the licensing process by allowing access to the expertise of other trusted regulatory partners, including those in Canada and the USA. So the MHRA will retain ultimate authority to accept or reject applications submitted under the IRP, but the shared global expertise fundamental in the IRP process is designed to result in a more rapid, efficient and cost-effective process for applicants. As part of this procedure, we'll also be restarting a programme of MAA inspections. So previously we conducted these when we were part of the EU, and as these are valuable, we're going to incorporate these further into our inspection programme going forward. So thank you very much for your time today.
Apologies. Thank you, Rachel. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So I'm back to provide a summary from FDA and MHRA perspective. GCP RRAs are a valuable tool for regulatory authorities to assess compliance, but will not replace GCP inspections due to their limitations, which we must recognize. And also preparation for on-site or remote inspections is pretty similar. Document review, interviews, and document requests from the MHRA perspective don't change just because an inspector is in their home office rather than a conference room in your head office.